I want to introduce you to the topic of epistemology. So what is epistemology? Epistemology is a subtopic within philosophy. And it's not just a name for some arbitrary class of things. What we're trying to get at in epistemology are questions about knowledge and when belief is justified or rational. First question I mentioned there is knowledge. What is it? How do we come to know something? And what does that look like? The second question is what does it take for a belief to be justified or rational, or what does it take for you to be entitled to a belief? Or we're just moving down to more colloquial terms, what does it take for it to be okay for you to believe something? Here's a few answers to that question. Maybe it takes certainty. Maybe you have to be absolutely certain of the thing. A different but related notion is maybe your belief has to be infallible, has to be impossible that you're wrong. Now, those two things come apart. You could be certain of something just because that's a psychological notion. That's just a claim about how you feel in your head, so to speak. You could be certain of something and be totally wrong, right? I'm sure we've all had this experience where we're absolutely certain of something, and it turns out we are completely wrong, completely incorrect. But to be infallible it's a technical term that means it's actually impossible that you're wrong. You could actually have an infallible belief without being certain because you're not sure that it's infallible. So does it take certainty for you to be justified in having a belief, for you to be entitled to form that belief? Or does it take infallibility? Those are really high standards, right? For justification. Surely you might think we could be justified in believing something without being certain or without being infallible. We could have fallibly justified beliefs, you could say, in super jargony terms. But if you justifiably believe, or what if you believe that you're going to lose the lottery when you buy a ticket? So say you buy a ticket to the lottery, you believe that you're going to lose. The odds are overwhelmingly in your favor for that belief. You're almost surely going to lose, but it's not a sure thing. So you shouldn't be certain. It's not infallible. It's possible that you could be right. So you're not infallible. Infallible is a very high standard. It has to be totally impossible, not just really improbable, right? So it actually turns out if certainty or infallibility is the standard for justification, you're not justified in believing that you're going to lose the lottery. So that's maybe a point in favor of saying, yeah, certainty and infallibility cannot be the standard for justification. But what then? What is the standard? Is it just having pretty good evidence? Do you need to have actual physical or empirical evidence? Or is evidence to be interpreted more broadly? Right? That's another question, right? You might think that, yes, you should have good evidence for what you believe. But then we have to ask what evidence is. Is evidence an empirical thing, something you sense with the senses? It better not be, because then we don't have any evidence for historical claims. We're not actually on the battlefield looking at the old musket balls or things like that. We're listening to testimony. So then what is evidence? Well, maybe evidence is just something that makes it really likely that your belief is true. In which case, it turns out faith, as we've seen, is compatible with evidence, right? Because you could have faith in something that is very likely to be true. Okay, so, or maybe you want to say that really being justified in a belief is about the reliability of the source of your belief, right? You can have a belief that comes from testimony, like we just showed in the historical case. Almost all of our historical claims are based on testimony, somebody telling us that it's true, somebody reliable telling it's true. And certainly there's a difference between the reliability of reliability of different sources of testimony. Right? So someone you could trust could be really reliable. They're right most of the time. They're a historian at a prestigious university or something like that. They've studied it for 40 years. This is the topic of their historical study. It's not like they're a historian who studies something else and they're guessing on this. That would be a really reliable source, a historian studying the topic that they're testifying about. Think about an unreliable source would be my 2-year-old daughter. If you asked her who won the Battle of San Jacinto, or something like that, she wouldn't be able to answer that question. And if she did, it would be totally unreliable. Now, you might be thinking, what's the relevance of all these questions? Well, the relevance is very concrete in many cases. We've been talking at a fairly abstract level But we talked about cases like the lottery. We talked about cases about evidence and faith, right? That's pretty important. But think about it even at the more day-to-day level. If you're talking about the reliability of the source of a testimony, think about the ways that we are gathering news now in ways that we never have before. So it turns out the majority of Americans use a social media platform as the primary source for news for them. And we have to ask, people have started to worry about this because social media, they've kind of developed their criteria for straining out bad sources of news. Maybe that criteria is too strict. Maybe they're straining out sources of news on the basis of politics rather than reliability. But at the same time, we've got lots of sources of news, or at least we recently did. I think we still do have lots of sources of news coming through social media that are totally unreliable. Turns out most people, when they are reading news on social media, are not picking out fine-grained sources one from another. Oh, this is the article, an article from a source that I trust. This is not one from a source that I trust. A lot of people have a method of just reading what's on the feed and kind of believing it. And so the question of whether you're entitled to a belief and when, on what basis of reliability, is really crucially important, right? We can have really bad results when people are not relying on reliable sources. Okay, to give you one more super applied context where epistemology is really important, think about what we should do when two experts disagree. We rely on experts for so many things. Think about just the COVID crisis, for example. I'm not an epistemologist. I'm not an epidemiologist. And so I'm relying completely on experts for my knowledge, or at least my belief, about how different contagious diseases work. And this is true in general. We rely on experts about history. We rely on experts about literature even sometimes. We're constantly relying on experts, and I would argue we even more so now and more every day are relying on experts, for better or worse. That's a question we could talk about later. But to some extent, we have to rely on experts. And what do you do, as often happens when two experts disagree? You could ask another question. How do you even identify an expert as a non-expert? Because as a non-expert, you don't have the knowledge that the expert has. So how do you even identify them? What happens when they disagree, assuming you can identify them? This is a second question, a separate question. You don't have knowledge to adjudicate between the two experts. So when the two experts disagree, or when the group of experts is kind of roughly evenly split on a question, who should you trust, if anyone? So this is a question about how we should go about believing, how we should form our beliefs. Can we have knowledge in this case? Can we have a justified belief? Is there any way for us to discriminate between the two experts or the two groups of experts when they disagree? And so now we're getting to the point where we see how epistemology can be very important in applied context, in the real world context, right? And hopefully that shows you that that importance can kind of travel back up to the more abstract level, right? It's only by, in many cases, it's only going to be by determining these general, the answers to these general questions about what it takes to be justified. Do we need evidence? How much? What's the reliability of the source got to be like? That we can determine the answers to these specific questions in applied contexts. So that is an intro to epistemology.